everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on driving SharePoint strategy. My name is Yarin, and I'll start out our webinar today. Before we get into the good stuff, let's start out with a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, the webinar is being recorded, so we'll send out a recording or a link to the recording within the next day or so to everyone who signed up. So if you want to share it with your colleagues and so forth, we'll get all of that to you. You can connect with us on Twitter throughout the webinar and afterwards using @Cardiolog and our host, The Moss Show. And then, of course, if you do have any questions throughout today's webinar, feel free to send those through in the GoToWebinars questions box. And we'll make sure to leave some time towards the end of today's webinar in order to answer all of your questions. The agenda, we'll start with a very short introduction, talk about who we are, introduce our guest. From there, we'll jump into our main topic, which is driving SharePoint strategy. We'll then have a short demo on how analytics can help with that strategy. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, conclude with some Q&A as well. So a very brief introduction for those of you who are not familiar. Intlock, we've been around for almost 10 years now, since 2005. We provide a reporting and web analytics solution for SharePoint and are compatible with all versions of SharePoint from 2003 all the way through 2013 for the on-prem versions. And it can also track SharePoint Online and Office 365, and as well as third-party tools like Yammer, Citrion, CRM systems, and so forth. Our key goal is to help our customers constantly improve and enhance SharePoint based on how it's being used. So the idea is to be able to monitor and then also engage with users with the end goal of constantly enhancing and improving SharePoint for our users. All right, I'm very happy to introduce our guest today. Our guest is Hilton Giesenow. Hilton is a Microsoft MVP and a true expert in the SharePoint space. Hilton, we're very happy that you can join us today, and I'll go ahead and make you presenter. You can take it away.
Okay, thank you. I don't know about the true expert part. Maybe we'll leave that up to the audience to to see at the end of the session. But first of all, thank you for inviting me to come and present, and thank you everybody for coming and joining in. I hope you'll find the session worthwhile. We'll talk about, I hope, some fascinating and interesting things, and perhaps at the end in the Q&A, I'd love to also hear maybe some of your experiences with some of the topics that we're going to talk about. Before we do, though, let me give a quick introduction so people know who I am. My name, as Yarin said, is Hilton Giesenow. I'm a SharePoint MVP, a 10 times MVP, based out of beautiful, sunny, most of the time at least, Cape Town in South Africa. So I put a little picture up there. You can see that sort of big oval. That was the Soccer World Cup stadium when we hosted the World Cup a few years ago. Got some contact details on the bottom left as well, my email, my Twitter, and so on. During the day, I run a consultancy here in South Africa called Experts Inside. It's a global consultancy, and I run the South African arm of that. And we're a reasonably full-service SharePoint partner, so we do infrastructure design and service setup and develop custom solutions and so on. But one of the things that makes us a little bit unique is we focus quite a bit on SharePoint strategy engagements. So we have a program that we work with customers to help them actually leverage SharePoint more effectively than they hopefully have been doing in previous versions or previous years. So it's a particular engagement that we do, and obviously the goal of this session isn't to be a sales call, but if anybody wants to find out more about it and so on, I certainly wouldn't be upset to take them through them. But the goal of this presentation essentially is to share some of the ideas and experiences and possibly even some of the tools that we use with customers that we've found successful that you can hopefully take back into your either your organizations or your customers, depending on where you're coming from. And then just down on the bottom there as well, I have a SharePoint podcast called The Moss Show. It's been pretty unloved in the last few months. Been busy with, aside from customer work, some other fascinating projects that are coming to fruition soon. But it's a SharePoint podcast that I've been running for a few years, and I'd love you to check it out. Always looking for new listeners, new show ideas, new guests, and so on. So always looking for feedback there. Okay, with that, let's jump into the main topic. And what we're going to be talking about essentially is SharePoint strategy. But I want to understand I want to set the scene at least of understanding what that means in context, and so on. So I want to paint a picture for you of, you could call it a tale of two cities if you're familiar with the book by that title. We're going to modify it very slightly here and talk about a tale of two SharePoints. And I'm going to discuss with you two customers that I've worked with in recent times. In fact, I happen to be on site at one of the customers today doing some of this work. But two customers that we and my colleagues and I have worked with over a number of years working on strategy-related initiatives. And it paints a picture of where these companies have come from and some of how they've ended up in this situation. Now, I'm sure many of you will have far greater success than possibly these customers have had, but perhaps some elements of it reflect some of the scenarios that you've seen as well. So let's look at the customer scenarios, and in particular why SharePoint strategy is relevant to them. On the one hand, we have a customer who's been on SharePoint since not just the 2001 version of the product, but actually since the year 2001. So they're approaching 14, 15 odd years with SharePoint. They've progressed to 2007. They skipped 2003, went to 2010, been there for a while, and they're now evaluating an upgrade to 2013. So a long SharePoint history with the product and with the platform. Interestingly, very development heavy. So they have 200 odd custom internal applications. So things like leave applications and onboarding, all of those kind of things. They've long ago decided that SharePoint is their strategic application development platform. Strong intranet presence, so they're obviously running SharePoint as the intranet, heavily customized and branded and so on. Strong pockets of document management. Now, I put these intranet and DMS terms in inverted commas because they're pretty overloaded terms. I don't actually like them for that reason, but nonetheless, maybe it's the easiest way just to understand some elements of it. So we're talking more than just storage, maybe starting to do things like metadata or maybe some versioning, things like that, but some very strong versions of it, but really pockets around the organization. Many departments still sitting in filing cabinets 14 years into a SharePoint experience there. So a lot of file share stuff as well, and as I mentioned, a lot of paper. Looking at the other customer, another customer that I'm working with, they started SharePoint, their SharePoint journey in 2007. So on the 2007 version, they've got a few farms still running in 2010, as well as that original 2007, and they now have a SharePoint 2013 farm as well. Not for any productive reason, they've just never quite figured out how to migrate from any of them off of any of them. So we're facing some interesting licensing discussions there all of a sudden, as you can imagine. Also a long SharePoint history, as you can see, though, and also interestingly, very development heavy. So they haven't put a lot of custom applications on. They have a few of those, but certainly the SharePoint itself is very heavily branded intranet, and these custom solutions and so on. So they've got a strong intranet presence there as well. And they have pockets of document storage. So they still have a very large file share, but they have certain pockets where certain elements of that have been migrated into SharePoint in the hopes, of course, that magically we would have a document management brush that we'd be able to paint the organization with. And they've still got a surprisingly large amount of paper physically sitting in boxes and archives and so on. So we see two interesting aspects shared across these two customers, aside from the points listed up there. We see a very poor return on investment from the actual platform for both customers, even customers that have had such a long history with the product. And we see very few out-of-box solutions, which is fascinating. Customers that have been on the product, in one case here for well over a decade, still very, very light touch of actual out-of-box implementations. I had a chat with one of the business users recently and showed them something called the document information panel in SharePoint, if you're familiar with that, where SharePoint metadata can actually come up and pop up in Microsoft Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, so you never even have to actually see the SharePoint screens in order to interact with the metadata, for example. And the customer was convinced that I was lying to them, that this was a 2013 only feature, and that's why they didn't have access to it. The fact is that it's been in the product for years. So surprising that customers even who've been on the product for a very long time aren't even necessarily aware of the low-hanging fruit out-of-box kind of capabilities. So it's experiences like this that have led us to start working more strategically with clients. And we typically see almost two kinds of diverging scenarios with SharePoint, either across the platform or perhaps within specific pockets in the organization. We get the very stuffed and overloaded and struggling to actually do its job SharePoint, as you can see, for example, with this train in the particular scenario, or we see the alternate. We see these giant empty empty areas of SharePoint. I like to call these the scaffolding, these sort of scaffoldings that were put in place that that were never used and in many cases have become out of date. So one of the customers, for example, when they implemented the 2007 version of SharePoint, had a consultancy come in and build their entire organizational hierarchy into SharePoint, most of which never got used, so it's completely empty and even more at this point, as one can imagine, particularly out of date. The entire organizational structure has changed twice since that SharePoint version of it was put in place. Now, the saddest thing for me, I guess, about that is that being that I work with SharePoint and that I'm a SharePoint consultant, I have a lot of passion for the product, and it's because I see the tremendous potential that SharePoint can have. I like to tell customers, especially newer customers maybe to SharePoint, that SharePoint is in some ways akin to SAP. Now, of course, it's not an ERP tool, it's not an enterprise resource planning tool, it's an enterprise information management tool. It doesn't deal with transactional records. So I've got customers, for example, that are large national retail customers. For them, point of sale, the actual tills where customers can swipe their products and pay for their products is the heartbeat of the business. If the tills are down, the business is effectively down. And that's obviously not the case for customers like that who are using SharePoint. But customers who are more information-centric, perhaps consulting firms where the primary documentation is sitting on SharePoint, or project management engineering firms where the project documents are on SharePoint, for example, SharePoint can be far more of the heartbeat of the organization, even around that unstructured information, and effectively be just as critical to the organization as SAP can be to other organizations. We like to refer to SharePoint, and I'm sure many of you have heard this analogy, as the Swiss Army knife of the organization, or the operating system of the organization in many ways. So SharePoint can be as relevant to an organization as SAP. And so it really is a case of trying to overcome some of those challenges and really get it right. So a lot of customers are asking, how do we get it right with SharePoint? And over the years, I've spoken with customers and I've presented at conferences and so on, and we've spoken about some of these topics about trying to get it right with SharePoint. And some of the things that we've worked with in the past are understanding, well, what exactly does right mean? Let's understand perhaps that there's different kinds of rights. For example, there's not just one right. Maybe it's about things like getting the right roles on board, for example, the various hats that make up a SharePoint competency or a SharePoint practice in an organization. And I like to also explain to customers that hats and headcounts aren't necessarily the same. One person could wear many hats and multiple people could wear the same kind of hat. So, for example, you could have multiple SharePoint developers on the team, but it's also about understanding what those roles are and who's fulfilling those roles. So this is an example of a slide that AvePoint, I'm sure many of you are familiar with them as a SharePoint backup and administration and so on, a tool. They're very involved in the community, do a lot of talks at conferences and so on. This is a slide that they've presented at conferences in the past that I found useful to explain some of these concepts to customers. Traditionally, we have people in the organization with SharePoint in their title, in their job title. So we have SharePoint developers. We have, for example, SharePoint project managers in some cases, for example. But the interesting thing is there are a lot of other roles that can be essential to getting SharePoint right. Now, some of these we would think about. If we're doing a lot of custom dev, we may have a tester on board. We may have graphic artists that are available to the SharePoint team, for example. But there's some fascinating ones that are not often considered, but that can be instrumental in making SharePoint successful in an organization. One of those is the SharePoint Strategic Advisor in the top left. And it's interesting that AvePoint circled it in red. It's almost to illustrate that this probably is a role that's best fulfilled by somebody external to the organization. Of course, I'm not averse to that being an external consultant. I'm happy for customers to bring me in. But the advantage to that is if you've got an advisor, not necessarily somebody who's 40 hours plus a week doing the work, but somebody who can come in at touch points and guide you on perhaps what other people in the industry are doing or what other customers in other industries are doing to be successful to SharePoint, that's a useful thing. But the other fascinating role that I found when I first saw the slide was the SharePoint Platform Marketer, which is, again, a role that most customers that I encounter don't have, but it's interesting how successful this person can be in terms of evangelizing or marketing or selling the SharePoint capability into the organization and essentially just being passionate about what SharePoint can do and selling that story across the organization. On top, notice that we're not looking at a title of the slide there, but the executive champions are actual roles in the organization that span across the actual SharePoint competency. So we're talking about right roles there. Another right to look at as well when getting SharePoint success in place is also understanding things like the right projects. And that means some fascinating things. We see SharePoint often used in organizations, and I'm sure many of you, again, have had a lot of successes with SharePoint, but I'm sure many will also recognize some of the metaphors and ideas here. We typically see many long-term or strategic projects that companies invest in with SharePoint. The kind of projects that span months, potentially even into years. And often it's things with the word enterprise in front. So enterprise document management, and I've expressed my view on that term. Enterprise internet, enterprise social, for example. Some other great overloaded terms like enterprise knowledge management, enterprise records management, for example. And when I talk about the terms being overloaded and so on, it's not to say that they're without value. It's just that these terms sometimes become so overloaded it's hard to even understand what success could mean for the project. Another interesting place that we play in the SharePoint world often is the medium-term projects. So the projects that are a number of weeks to potentially and most typically a couple of months. So that could be document management within a department, or perhaps things like more specific larger point solutions like contract management or project management on SharePoint, for example, perhaps some reporting dashboard kind of things, some large enterprise process grade workflow solutions, for example. Maybe we were looking at some third-party add-ons and so on. Strangely enough, there's another whole world to SharePoint, and it's fascinating how often this gets overlooked. It's the super quick wins, the low-hanging fruit kind of projects, the projects that take hours to days potentially to deliver. So something we could sit with a customer and put the entire solution potentially together in the same day with a customer. And sometimes it's just out-of-box functionality. It's some contact lists, some task lists, maybe a calendar, maybe linking the task list to a calendar, for example. Maybe it's even taking out-of-box standard functionality like a document library and just adding some views or some fields. And it's fascinating how much of this gets missed. We find customers traditionally embark on the very long, very smart, very intensive projects and often typically miss the super quick wins. Now, I think there's various reasons for that. I think sometimes we've got agendas and we've got roles and we maybe even have jobs to protect, so to speak. But it's interesting that the people who have SharePoint in their job titles are often not the best people to necessarily deliver the super quick wins. You know, we often have SharePoint developers, for example, whose primary training, if any at all, on SharePoint has been hardcore developer training. It's building custom workflows and it's implementing custom site templates and so on. And surprisingly, they don't necessarily know how to do some of the very simple, straightforward, out-of-box things. Similarly, the infrastructure people, the people who are installing, monitoring, backing up, and checking disk storage and memory usage and so on the SharePoint service also aren't necessarily the best skilled to be able to deliver the standard out-of-box functionality. And yet, interestingly enough, sometimes this can be a huge value to SharePoint overall in the organization. I don't know if anybody has heard of the exhibit called The Art of the Brick. It's an artist who's going around exhibiting some of the amazingly interesting work that he's done with Lego bricks, just standard Lego bricks, building fantastic and fascinating artworks. This was one that I saw recently. He happened to come down to our end of the world and exhibit. And this was an entire full-scale Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton built purely out of Lego bricks. Now, in this particular case, I think it was 80,000 plus Lego bricks, so not something one would throw together in an evening. But it's fascinating what one can do, even with tiny little small projects that can stack up to being tremendous quick wins in the net effect that they can have. And the third right we'll talk about here is what one could call the right direction, or assessing what is our actual long-term roadmap with SharePoint. So as an example, this was some work that was done by a lady named Sadelev van Buren in around the 2010, 2011 timeframe. There was a sort of a 1.1 version of this. And it was fascinating when it came out at the time. It was a way that she put together to assess your SharePoint maturity, or your maturity with the product and with the platform. If you're familiar with the CMMI model, it sort of follows a similar concept. If you're not, it doesn't really matter too much. It's relatively easy to read and understand. Essentially, your maturity goes from a base level up to higher and potentially ultimate levels of maturity with a particular area or discipline. And then you'd look at disciplines like publication with SharePoint, or collaboration, or business process automation, and so on. One thing that wasn't really explicit in the model, but that I found a fascinating emergent principle, was that I also felt that maturity was moving along the scale as well. So publication and collaboration are the best places to start with SharePoint, whereas integration and insight are not great places to start your first organizational project with SharePoint. If the first time your company is using SharePoint is a level 500 integration and insight project, the project's far more likely to fail and the platform's far more likely to fail than starting with, let's say, a level 100 publication or collaboration type project. Now, I have certain issues with this particular model. There are reasons that I don't particularly ascribe to it, but certainly it was an interesting work that was done at the time, and it provides tremendous food for thought in terms of understanding the right directions that we may want to place or may want to head in when working with a project. And there's sort of a stage 3 right direction of a 3.5, if you like, which is also understanding the right timing. So if we go back to that integration project, that may not be an appropriate project to do in the organization at all. If we think about things like social, perhaps your organization will never be ready for enterprise social, whatever that means. But sometimes it is the right product or the right project for your company, but not necessarily the right time to be embarking on that. Sometimes your users need to get more familiar with the basic aspects of the platform before we jump into a more advanced project. Now, as I mentioned, those 3 rights are things that we've worked with customers before, and it's not to say that those aren't without value. Sometimes a strategy in the past, for example, has included or focused on those primary elements. But the hard part is there's so many other things that we need to know of and be cognizant of and have on our radar to try and succeed with SharePoint altogether. So we have things like infrastructure planning and backups and so on. We have to understand things like what adoption means, where the cloud fits in, what kind of overall management and usage and monitoring and all kinds of other technical, developmental, and business conceptual things that we're trying to juggle in our heads at the same time and try and get right as well. Governance, adoption, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with a lot of these kinds of terms in working with SharePoint in your organization. So we found that although those 3 rights that we've spoken about are certainly foundational elements of a strategy with a SharePoint and with SharePoint customers, they need to be within the context of something greater. And that's where we've started to put together programs working with customers with more comprehensive game plans, more comprehensive overall programs with customers. And if you want to sort of contain it into a nutshell, maybe look at a very brief overview conceptually of what we're trying to achieve, we've realized that it's essential for customers to have a formally defined SharePoint practice. Not just people with SharePoint in their job titles, but people who are able to come together cohesively as a team beyond the scope of a project. It's not the intranet team, for example, or the replace the S or X or G drive team. It's the SharePoint practice who's there and whose focus is to get SharePoint entrenched, adopted, used, and delivering value to the overall organization. So the idea of a practice, and this is more of like an internal consulting practice than it is of a community of practice, for example. But the idea behind that practice is also there. How do we, like an intranet or a DMS, how do we get document management right? Similarly, how do we get a SharePoint practice working or a SharePoint practice right? So this is where we've started to put a metaphor together with customers. And you could, if you like, the sports analogy, that's why I showed the sports team, sports field, for example. You could use some kind of sports analogy or metaphor, if you like. We like to use a business-like analogy with customers because we find the metaphors help to clarify the roles and help to clarify the efforts and focus what we're trying to do as an overall practice. So as a business, as a kind of startup business that the SharePoint practice might be in the greater enterprise organization, we say, let's have a business plan for that business. So just like any other kind of business plan, we'd have things like potentially a competitor analysis, which starts to get interesting, maybe a SWOT analysis. We want to make sure that we're clearly defining a vision, mission, and goals, for example, and a product description. What exactly is this nebulous conceptual beast of a thing called SharePoint that we're offering to our customers, being the actual people inside of the business? So we put together some sort of an actual business plan. Again, we've got some specific tools and things that help with this. But the idea is, again, to use metaphors that can help us focus our efforts. So if we look at more detail around a business plan, for example, we'd look at very clearly defining the vision, the mission, and the goals for what we're trying to achieve. And like with any business, that changes over time. So what we're trying to do now is not necessarily what we'll be aiming to do as a practice in 6 months' time, and certainly shouldn't be what we're aiming to do as a practice 18 months from now. But defining that vision, mission, and goal also help us to focus the efforts of which projects we're going to focus on and not focus on necessarily, and helps us define the strategy and the action plan. Strategy here, though, we're seeing as being different kinds of sub-strategies that form the overall strategy. So it's about, for example, as a business, in air quotes, so to speak, having a marketing strategy. How exactly are we going to engage the customers in the business in terms of explaining what SharePoint is, getting them on board and potentially assessing their solutions and so on, passing that over to engineering or operations who will actually deliver something. And finally, it's about taking those sub-strategies and breaking them down into roadmap, into action plans. So specific roadmaps for the different operating areas of the business, if you like, potentially budgets and immediate next steps and so on. We'll see some of those coming up a little bit later. So let's dive into one of those to make it a little bit more practical. If we look at a marketing strategy, so to speak, of the organization, as soon as we start to use these metaphors, there are also tools that these disciplines have that we can start to bring to bear. So in the sales and marketing world, for example, you might be familiar with the concept of a sales funnel, for example, where we try to identify and collect customers into our funnel, push them down through the funnel until they ultimately become, so to speak, paying customers. And there are various stages typically in these funnels. So these are just some that I've Google Binged on the internet. You can go ahead and do the same for sales funnel, for example. Some of them are very explicit about the stages and want to understand what the stages are so that you can understand what to do at each stage. And also then, interestingly, what kind of tools to apply. So here's one that's quite a bit more complex. There's a multi-stage funnel. Maybe marketing department in this e-commerce company is about bringing people to the website as a stage one funnel, and once they're on the website, converting them into paid customers. So you can see you can go quite deep in something like this. But again, it's useful not necessarily to become overly analyzed, but to assist in defining perhaps what those sales and marketing elements and stages are in converting presenting to internal customers and converting them, so to speak, into paying customers. One of those tools could be, for example, understanding what your product catalog is. Now, in the services world, delivering SharePoint projects, we might see this as a service catalog, for example. But helping to, or using some of these metaphors helps us to define exactly why we might be putting a service catalog together and then going and actually building out a service catalog. Interestingly, we can start to, once we have a service/product catalog, we can even start to define pricing on how we may want to engage the rest of the business, to even at some point be very explicit about a chargeback model. So it gives us a foot in the ground to start introducing that kind of maturity as the SharePoint practice and inside of IT potentially in the organization. But also helps us to define exactly what we're aiming to do. Recall the roadmap and the maturity models before. We can deliver and unfold any kind of feature for any of our teams, any of our business users in the organization. But are those the right things to do? One of the customers that we're working with, for example, I'm sure many of you know, SharePoint has 500 bells and whistles and features and so on that you can use. But we've taken this customer and said, your primary goal or your primary problem dealing with SharePoint is trying to get basic adoption of the basic feature set. So we're not going to deal with blogs and wikis and intranet and custom portals and enterprise social network and so on. The two primary areas of functionality we're going to focus on, the two items in our product catalog, are document management and basic lists and library tracking, for example. So that's the kind of idea of how we could define that. And then once you do that, you can, the sky's the limit in terms of how you may want to present that as an actual catalog. If we look at another area of the business, maybe the operational and engineering strategies, essentially that's just about defining what the SDLC is. What is the system development lifecycle for SharePoint projects in your organization? Perhaps it's the same as other projects, perhaps it needs to differ a little bit, but it's about defining that and being explicit about it up front. Perhaps it's different for the traditional SharePoint projects, like the intranet rebuild or the HR leave form application, versus some of the out-of-box things like just enabling a document library for a particular area of the business. And ultimately, any business, just like our mock business here, is in the game to make a profit. The goal is a bit different here, though, because there aren't necessarily cash flows between the divisions in your organization. The SharePoint practice isn't necessarily charging the areas of the business actual dollar amounts, for instance. But it's still useful as a business to understand our, so to speak, profitability. And maybe that's just about understanding that the return on investment from SharePoint as a business, and therefore the return on investment from the enterprise for the projects you deliver is about understanding the revenue versus the expenses. Sometimes the expenses are very easy and blatantly clear to calculate. We may have an external vendor coming to deliver a custom contract management solution at X thousands of dollars, for example. But we very seldom really spend a lot of time working out what the potential value to the business is. Some organizations require a business case justification, so there might be some effort around that. Sometimes it's just a token effort. Rarely do we really spend time trying to calculate what this is. So if we were to take something like a sample roadmap, we'd look at all of the things that we want to build for customers, try and plan that out, which of course helps with resource planning and so on. But it helps us be explicit about what the roadmap is that we're trying to achieve with SharePoint, and think back to things like the maturity level. Sometimes it's about moving the projects to the right starting point in terms of their maturity. But a sales process helps us, for example, to put that roadmap together. And then the next stage, as the financial officer of the company, so to speak, is to go ahead and try and map out those ROIs. So look at the estimated cost or expenditure, look at the estimated actual business return that the project is hopefully going to entail, and then calculate an ROI of the one subtracted from the other. And you'd be looking at some kind of ROI to the project, and potentially you'd be looking at some kind of return percentage, if you like. So I've just taken very simple numbers and I've just used the one as a factor to the other. And then I've color-coded it in Excel here. And what's interesting is what gets revealed is that things like productivity solutions, if we were to estimate them in this mock-up customer, and things like collaboration solutions are really where we can see it's the kind of things we can deliver the quickest and easiest out of box to customers and likely get the highest return on investment from the projects. Whereas, for example, maybe an external extranet is something that we could deliver on SharePoint, but SharePoint really isn't a great web content management, web publishing kind of engine, despite the fact that it's been sold as such for many years. So it's something that can be done, but it's typically much more expensive maybe than other competitors, and so the return on investment isn't necessarily there. So curiously enough, productivity and collaboration, which are the bread and butter of SharePoint, big surprise, come out as the clearest areas of where we should be focusing on as a SharePoint practice, despite the fact that we often get derailed, sometimes for political reasons. Now, the ROI thing is certainly not something that's necessarily easy to calculate, and that's one of the reasons, I guess, coming back full circle to the sponsors for today, but one of the reasons that I like working with Intlock and their Cardiolog suite is because they have a best-in-class suite that helps us actually try and measure some of these criteria. So if we want to understand what is collaboration going to translate to into our organization and how do we measure it, we need to assess things like how often are people coming to the portal, where are they going inside of our portal, are they actually accessing content, moving around, how long are they spending per pages, and so on. And Cardiolog is one of the kind of companies whose tools can help you do this kind of assessment. For example, there are, I'm actually going to go ahead and load it up, but there are some elements on Cardiolog's portal, for instance, and of course the site's up there, where they can show how they've helped explicitly to determine or extract an ROI for SharePoint. So one example that I like here is that the tool is able to identify videos that were viewed for 30 seconds or 20 seconds or less. And as a result, the customers were able to identify that the video content was clearly inappropriate or not hitting the mark in terms of what customers were wanting. So there are other things here, and of course, Cardiolog will have case studies on the website that you can go through and so on to look at how you could use tools like this to get a better ROI for SharePoint overall. So essentially, again, the goal here was to present some of the things that we've learned as successes in our practice, dealing with customers, dealing across industries, customer sizes, and so on, everything from 2 or 3 people organizations up to tens of thousands, and some of the things that we found useful. It's about getting some of those 3 rights, the right roles, the right projects, and the right direction and the right timing around them, but ideally wrapping those in the context of something like a more defined SharePoint practice. So I hope you found it interesting. I'm going to hang around, of course, for the Q&A. If you've got any questions, then shoot them along. Thanks for watching.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that, Hilton. Definitely some great insights there that I think everyone was able to learn from. I know I definitely took some great insights for some of our upcoming projects. I'll move on with just to show everyone a few more slides of how these analytics can tie into some of the strategies that Hilton was talking about. But again, just to remind you, if you do have any questions in the next last few minutes of the webinar, send those over through the questions box, and we'll get to them in about 10 minutes or so. So Hilton touched about the need for analytics, and I want to dive a little deeper into that. So really, why do we need analytics for SharePoint? And I think the key here is that you can only manage what you can measure. And oftentimes what we see is that folks deploy SharePoint, spend a lot of time and money and efforts building out their SharePoint environments, but they're never sure to say, is this working? Is it doing what we hoped it would do? Are people using it, leveraging the different features and apps that we built? And so the idea is, and really the bottom line is, once we have these strategies, once we've deployed SharePoint, we now have to be able to measure what's going on in order to better manage that technology. And if we break this down into specific areas, first of all, is adoption. So if you're migrating or deploying a new app, going to a new version of SharePoint, and again, you spend a lot of time and efforts and resources building out these new platforms, we want to make sure that we can measure that people are actually using these different tools. And so one of the keys to analytics is the fact that it allows us to track adoption and to pinpoint where adoption might be lacking. Are there specific groups in the organization that aren't adopting as well? Are there specific users and things of that sort? Productivity. So I think Hilton mentioned this a few times, where one of the main goals would be to improve the productivity within the organization. And again, we can use analytics to help measure that and make sure that we truly are helping our employees be more productive. Collaboration, a key to SharePoint, allowing organizations and teams to share content, whether that's documents or calendars, project and team sites. And then finally, allowing us to better engage the community in seeing what are some of the needs of our users and things of that sort. Jumping a little deeper, and again tying back to what Hilton mentioned about some of the actionable metrics, I want to show a few quick examples of how we can leverage these metrics in order to constantly improve and enhance SharePoint. And I'll focus on three main areas. One is users or adoption. Second is content. And three is search. I'll go over these main areas where we can help optimize and enhance our environment. So let's start out with actionable metrics for content. Now again, this can be used in a tool like Cardlog, but you can also leverage some of the out-of-the-box analytics that SharePoint has. The key to emphasize here is that you really need to be taking a look at analytics in order to better understand and manage the SharePoint environment. So a few quick examples: if you're able to detect what are the unused sites and really surface that information, right away you can free up space. And it's especially relevant if you're using cloud environments like Office 365, but even if you have an on-prem farm, you find out you have tens of thousands of unused site collections, that can really make a difference within the organization infrastructure. Unused links. Oftentimes we'll see that navigation bars on homepages are quite limited in the amount of space they have. And so once you're able to see what links are popular and which are not, we can go back and redesign those navigation bars to make sure people are viewing there and getting shortcuts to content that they truly need. Unused content, specifically prior to migration, helping us ease that migration process just a bit by being able to migrate less content or just the content that we really need in our next version of SharePoint, and allowing us to delete or perhaps archive content that really is not needed by our users. And then finally, for content area, external links, what we see is that many of our customers link to outside resources. So anything from external news articles to partner pages. And so again, the idea is to see what external content is most engaging, what should we continue to promote, and what content really do people not need and aren't using, and which links can we remove from our portal. If we go into the next area around users and adoption, let's take a look here at some of the actionable metrics. So first of all, identifying the top users within our organization. This earlier, Hilton called these the SharePoint marketer as a position that would be needed. Someone to really spread out the news and the greatness about SharePoint. And so once we know who are these top users, we can turn them into evangelists or marketers within their departments, so that each department have those evangelists to really spread the SharePoint love and show fellow colleagues how they can take advantage and increase their productivity and get their things done easier by taking advantage of SharePoint. Another example, identifying departments with low usage levels. What we oftentimes see is that an organization will tackle adoption from an organization-wide standpoint. Once you're able to look at these metrics, right away you can pinpoint the specific groups that are laggers and pinpoint them with things like training and more support, so we can improve those lagging groups' adoption. And then we have a better use of our resources like our training budgets and so forth, as opposed to giving each department or branch and organization the same amount of budgets for training. We can now allocate that training to the groups that really need it. Another example around usage and adoption, we can track mobile trends, which is definitely key these days when there are so many devices being used by our employees. Once we find out these trends, we can see if there's a need for us to make our SharePoint content easier to access through mobile devices. And furthermore, which devices? We don't want to waste lots of time and budgets and resources building an iOS app if everyone is using Android to access our environment. So a key here to learn about mobile trends. And then finally, going to the last area, we'll talk about search briefly and talk about actionable metrics and how we can leverage analytics for search. So what are the most popular search terms? If you can imagine, if everyone in an organization every day searches for the same content, let's put a nice big link on the homepage of our intranet and save thousands of seconds times X employees times days of the year and so forth. And you can just imagine there how it's so easy to boost productivity by making sure people don't have to waste time searching for that popular content. Another example here, failed searches. Are there specific terms people are searching for that are retrieving 0 results, that they can't find any content? Just imagine how much time those folks are wasting when they do a search and don't find any of the results. And so again, once we're able to identify these items, we can go back and improve our search as well. From there, touch upon a few more additions. So from just talking about content, we can talk about social metrics. So besides just viewing content, tracking things like influential content, so everything from comments on content has been liked the most or has the highest ratings or the most followers. Those are some great indicators to find out which content is really most influential and what should be surfaced throughout the organization. We talk about users, but besides just who's using the portal more, who's interacting and most influential within our organization, and again, how do we find out who are the influential users with things like users that have the most followers, that are posting and commenting the most, really impacting most around our environment. All right, so that's our webinar for today. I hope you're able to take a few points here on how you can really leverage and optimize your SharePoint strategy. Let's go ahead and jump into any questions that you might have. And again, if you have any more questions at this time, feel free to send those over in the GoTo webinar questions box. Hilton, I'll just fire some of these at you, and happy to get your insights. So first question here, does the strategy you're talking about change when talking about Office 365?
That's an excellent question. Elements of the practice will change because you're not necessarily running infrastructure, so you aren't necessarily as focused on operational governance and things like tracking disk usage of the SQL databases and so on. But the interesting aspect is that, truth be told, I would say the elements of this strategy wouldn't even change 10 years ago if you were using Lotus Notes. I think they apply as equally to a large-scale enterprise collaboration, content management kind of tool of any sort. So certainly, if they would apply to a Lotus Notes or a Documentum, for example, sure they would apply just as well to to Office 365. Great question.
All right, next one. So Mark is saying, interesting. I'm the SharePoint guy. Without a real team, where do I start?
Okay, so you were the guy closest to the door when the other guy left, I'm taking it. So that also is a tremendous question. Sometimes some of the customers that I'm working with, some of them, as I mentioned, we have been on SharePoint for years, and sometimes we've had the luxury of working with them on projects over years, but we haven't necessarily had the luxury of doing this kind of work. Some of the customers I'm working with have identified the problem and decided comprehensively to tackle it and therefore throw budget and ultimately throw resources at it. As we start engaging, we explain to them that they're going to need more than just the guy. So your point is very well taken, that it does require a team, a village to raise a child, so to speak. But you're in a position where a lot of people are, and some of my customers that are where they are today started that way, having somebody wave the flag and so on. What I would say is maybe there are elements of there are ideas that we've discussed here that maybe don't make sense to fire up a full practice, but at least seeding the organization with some of the ideas can be helpful. So sometimes it's about introducing, for example, the financial department, or let's say the customer service department, whatever those kind of metaphors mean. We just don't have time to go into everything in this meeting, but R&D, for example, our model includes an R&D department, whatever that means. But there are elements of the practice and ideas that you can maybe use from the practice that can help you, not necessarily to sell SharePoint, because that might be part of it as well, but perhaps just to sell the idea of SharePoint as a more comprehensive solution. So if you were, for example, to make that a little bit more concrete, take some of the ideas of the sales practice. Maybe get the sales department up and running of your one-man company, and think through what maybe makes the most sense. Where are the glaring holes in your organization? Take some of those customers that I spoke about where maybe they had 5 people on the SharePoint team. It wasn't just a one-man team, but all of them were devs, and maybe 4 devs and a project manager. They're almost in a similar situation. What you want to do is say, what are the glaring holes of where SharePoint really, really should be better used in this organization? So things like maybe the low-hanging fruit of document management. That's where we really could be unlocking so much more value than what we're getting, and work out a way to maybe sell that story into the organization. Maybe you're not necessarily getting customers, but maybe it's about selling that to your management, to the executives, to the team, for example. But sometimes it could be about getting customers, about visiting people in the business that you've got contact with. And by the way, I'd be wary about dealing with IT. Often we're in IT, and we're the worst customers. Going to somebody higher up and saying, look, there's lots of people in IT who need document storage, has a lot less weight than saying, look how many people in the organization need better document storage. I've met with finance and HR and marketing and so on. Again, you need to be a little bit careful politically not to step on too many toes. But at the end of the day, if you can go to the appropriate people in your organization and say, there's some decent PT, some decent homework that I've done that can show that there really is tremendous value that can be unlocked, let's explore this further. Let's perhaps bring in an external consultant who's more experienced with it, or let's find some other way to throw resources at it that we can identify what the pie might look like to see what this overall SharePoint thing could be, and from there sort of take those baby steps in that order.
Okay, very nice. And then last question I see here. So we're still in 2010. Are there any key features you recommend we notice in 2013, or just wait for 2016?
Also a very interesting question. So just in terms of the timelines, Microsoft shifted the timelines out. Well, I mean, I guess to be fair, they never really painted a 2016 timeframe, but it's certainly coming out later than I was hoping that it would be coming to us. So, that wait might be longer than we may have originally anticipated in the community. So just be cognizant of that. But again, it's a good question, but it's almost a two-pronged question. I would say definitely there's important and valuable changes in 2013. There's lots of development level changes, and there's a lot of infrastructural improvements and so on. In terms of strategy, I mean, those are useful, but they're not really relevant to our conversation. There are a lot of things that make SharePoint, in my mind, 2013 easier to adopt. The look and feel I find a lot better. It's a lot more consistent across the board. And things like drag and drop for document management just makes it an easier sell in terms of adoption and so on. So certainly there are things that I would suggest going to 2013 for. But again, if you look at the overall idea of the strategy, I come back to what we said about Office 365 versus Notes and so on. There's tremendous value to a decent quality enterprise content management system in your organization. If you think just through the basics of, in inverted commas, document management, let me paint you what my definition of that is to maybe help clarify. But if you look at things like some of just the simple stories that we see over and over, if you look at enterprises that are on a file share versus on local machines, those local machines get stolen all the time, and then enterprise information is gone, or at least at high risk. So we get it onto the file share, but once it's on a file share, we have document storage. Arguably we have file storage, let alone document storage, let alone document management. So what are the typical versions of that? We see 10 files that are actually the same file, underscore v1, underscore v2, underscore v3, underscore v final, and then it's really the final one. We forgot to make another change, so now it's underscore v final. We email it to Bob Jones, who now makes his edits, and we get an underscore bg underscore v final, for example. So some of those things are such simple solutions to solve with SharePoint that, again, can add tremendous value to the organization. I'm dealing with one customer who has a lot of that, and they're finding they're struggling to just get everybody on board with basic versioning and basic centralizing of the documents. That's one aspect of it, and so everything ends up in email as attachments, which on its own is a high risk for various reasons. I'm sure some of them you can imagine. But that also means they're struggling to find those docs in email and so on. But one strange additional aspect to that is they're still on relatively small email boxes. So these highly intelligent, highly paid professionals in the organization are spending time every month cleaning out their Outlook inboxes to make space because they've hit their email limit, because they're sending attachments rather than sending links to documents in SharePoint. And all of this kind of functionality is stuff that's 100% out of box with going back to some extent to 2007, certainly in 2010, and improved in 2013.
All right, perfect. Last question I see here from Lil is asking, will you share a link to the recording of this webinar? And the answer, Lil, is yes. We will be sending out an email in the next day or two with a link, so you can see that. For now, that is all the questions we have. So again, Hilton, I thank you very much for sharing this wonderful information with our audience. Thank you very much.
Sure, it's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. It was a great opportunity to speak to everybody, and as Jeroen also said, I'm happy to carry on the conversations if you want to contact me by email, Twitter, any of those kind of things.
Perfect. And thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. Again, we'll send the link in about a day or so, and you can find all the contact details on the